The night was quiet, too quiet. The dim glow of streetlights flickered against the cold pavement as Daniel, the night security guard, made his usual rounds at the grand estate. The mansion was a fortress of wealth. Tall iron gates, sprawling gardens, and a driveway long enough to lose yourself in. But tonight, something felt off. He had worked security here for 3 years, watching over the property, the cars, and most importantly, the people inside. And while he wasn't one to get involved in the personal affairs of the rich, what he saw last night wouldn't let him sleep. Daniel had always been the kind of guy who minded his business. That's what the job required. Keep your head down, do your work, and go home. But when you work in the same place long enough, you notice things, patterns, people. And lately, one person stood out more than anyone else. Madeline, the millionaire's wife. She was beautiful, charming, and always carried herself like she owned the world. But last night, Daniel saw something that changed everything. It started with a car, a sleek black sedan, windows tinted too dark to see inside, pulling up to the estate's side entrance. Not the main gate, not the grand driveway, but the back entrance, the one rarely used, unless someone wanted to stay unnoticed. Daniel watched as the passenger door opened, and Madeline stepped out. She wasn't alone. A man, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, leaned in close to her. They exchanged whispers, laughter, something intimate. Then, before she slipped inside, Daniel caught something he couldn't ignore. The way she touched the man's face. The way he held her waist. It wasn't the kind of touch a married woman should have with a stranger. Daniel wasn't the kind to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was business. But deep down, he knew better. He had seen this before. In other places he worked, different people, same story, and it never ended well. So, for the first time in his career, he broke his own rule. He decided to warn someone. The next morning, after finishing his shift, Daniel took a deep breath and approached the one man who needed to hear the truth. James Carter, the millionaire himself. James was a man who had everything: money, power, success. But he wasn't the kind of man who liked surprises. He was sharp, calculating, and always in control. So, Daniel knew this conversation wouldn't be easy. James sat in his grand home office, the walls lined with expensive books that looked more for show than reading. He barely looked up from his desk when Daniel walked in. "Something important?" James asked, his voice low and steady. Daniel hesitated for a second, but then he spoke. "Sir, I know it's not my place, but I saw something last night. Your wife, she was with someone." For a moment, there was silence. James didn't react, didn't move. Then, slowly, he set down his pen and looked up. His eyes, cold and unreadable, locked onto Daniel's. "What exactly did you see?" Daniel explained, choosing his words carefully, not wanting to sound like he was gossiping or stirring trouble, just the facts. The car, the man, the way she acted. When he finished, James was still quiet, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. "Thank you for telling me," he finally said, his voice calm. Too calm. "You can go now." Daniel nodded and left. But something about James's reaction didn't sit right with him. No anger, no questions, nothing, just silence. And that silence felt more dangerous than any outburst. Then the next day, something unexpected happened. A bright red sports car rolled up to the mansion's gates, the kind of car that turned heads, that made a statement. It wasn't just expensive. It was aggressive, bold. And as it pulled in, Daniel's stomach twisted. He had a bad feeling about this. Who was in the car? Why was it here? And more importantly, what was James planning to do now that he knew the truth? Something told Daniel that whatever happened next, it wasn't going to be good. Daniel stood at his usual post by the gates, watching the red sports car glide up the driveway like it owned the place. The sun reflected off its sleek body, making it look even more expensive than it probably was. His instincts told him this wasn't just any visitor. This car had a purpose. As the car rolled to a stop, the driver's door opened, and out stepped a man Daniel had never seen before. He was tall, confident, and dressed like he belonged to the world of the rich. Sharp navy suit, polished shoes, and an air of arrogance. He didn't seem like a regular guest. There was something about the way he moved, the way his eyes scanned the mansion like he was sizing it up. Daniel's stomach tightened. Was this the same man from last night? The one with Madeline? Before he could get a closer look, James Carter stepped out onto the front steps. His expression was unreadable, but Daniel could tell he had been expecting this visitor. They exchanged a few words, too quiet for Daniel to hear, before James gestured for the man to follow him inside. The door shut behind them, leaving Daniel with nothing but his growing unease. Hours passed, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing inside that house. He had been around long enough to know when tension was in the air. The household staff moved cautiously, avoiding eye contact. The usual steady rhythm of the estate felt off. Later that evening, as Daniel walked the perimeter, he noticed another car arrive. This time, Madeline's. She stepped out, her designer heels clicking against the stone driveway. There was no hesitation in her stride, no sign that she had any idea what was waiting for her inside. If she had seen the red sports car, she didn't react. Or maybe she was just that good at hiding things. Daniel watched as she entered the house, his nerves on edge. He didn't know what was happening in there, but he had a bad feeling the walls of this perfect, luxurious life were about to crack. Inside, James sat across from the man in the navy suit, his fingers steepled in thought. The room was filled with an uncomfortable silence, the kind that weighed heavy, pressing against the walls. "I assume you know why I asked you here," James finally said, his voice controlled but firm. The man smirked, leaning back in his chair. "I can take a guess." James's jaw tightened. He had spent his entire life controlling everything. His business, his wealth, his reputation, and now something he had built was under threat. Not by a competitor, not by a financial scandal, but by something much closer. His wife. He had suspected things before. The late-night outings, the vague excuses, the way she had been distant lately, but hearing it from the security guard, that was different. That made it real. Madeline entered the room then, stopping in her tracks when she saw who was sitting across from her husband. For the first time, her perfect composure wavered. Her eyes flickered to James, searching his face. "What's going on?" James leaned back, his expression cold. "I was hoping you could tell me." The tension in the room was unbearable. The man in the suit, who Daniel now realized was no ordinary guest, just sat there, watching, waiting for someone to make a move. Outside, Daniel tried to focus on his job, but his mind kept going back to what was happening inside. He had warned James, but had he made a mistake? What if his warning had only made things worse? Then, suddenly the doors burst open. Madeline stormed out, her face pale, but her steps quick and determined. She didn't look back. She didn't hesitate. She got into her car, started the engine, and within seconds, she was gone. The man in the suit followed not long after, though much more calmly. He didn't rush. He didn't even seem rattled. He simply got into his red sports car, started the engine, and drove off like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something big. And Daniel had a feeling this wasn't the end of it. This was just the beginning. Daniel watched as the red sports car disappeared down the long driveway, its taillights glowing against the evening sky. The mansion stood still, eerily silent, after the storm that had just passed through. He didn't know exactly what had happened inside, but he knew one thing: whatever James had uncovered, it had been enough to send both Madeline and that man away. For the rest of the night, the house felt different. The usual movements of the staff were quieter, more careful. It was as if everyone knew something had shifted, but no one dared to speak about it. Daniel continued his rounds, but his mind kept replaying everything. The warning he had given, the way James had handled it, the look on Madeline's face when she realized she had been caught. Hours passed, and just as Daniel thought the night would end quietly, James stepped outside. He wasn't the same man Daniel had spoken to that morning. He looked lighter, not happy, but relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He walked slowly toward the garden, his hands in his pockets, taking in the cool night air. For a man who had just seen his world crack open, he seemed at peace. Daniel hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Sir, is everything all right?" James let out a small breath, almost like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "You know, Daniel, sometimes you think you have everything under control. You build a life, a home. You trust the people closest to you. And then one day, you realize you were blind the whole time." Daniel wasn't sure what to say. He had seen people react in all kinds of ways to betrayal, anger, denial, even revenge. But James, he just looked like a man who had accepted the truth. "Did she say anything before she left?" Daniel asked cautiously. James nodded. "She didn't deny it, didn't even try to explain. Just took what she could and left." He paused, looking up at the sky for a moment before turning back to Daniel. "I suppose that tells me everything I need to know." Daniel studied James's face, expecting to see resentment or bitterness, but there was none. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance. "You did the right thing telling me," James said after a moment. "Most people wouldn't have." Daniel nodded. "I figured you deserved to know." James gave a small, knowing smile. "And now I do." For the first time in years, James Carter stood in front of his own house and felt something strange: freedom. He had spent so much of his life chasing success, making sure everything was perfect. But tonight, he realized perfection had been an illusion all along. And maybe that was okay. As the night stretched on, Daniel resumed his watch, feeling a sense of closure he hadn't expected. The job would continue. The house would remain standing. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. And maybe that was for the best.